Welcome everyone on behalf of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Welcome to our panelists, guests that have joined us from Europe, from the United States, from China, from Russia. And welcome to all of you, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. To discuss a report that I have worked on together with a number of colleagues here in the Institute on the notion of European strategic autonomy. Now, the report has been published a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who have read it, in fact, for those of you who have not read it, perhaps Francesca, that I take the opportunity to thank here, can post it on the chat function. As I said, it was a report that was published a couple of weeks ago, and the reason why we decided to work on this here in the Institute is that I sort of felt that I bear a little bit of responsibility for this concept. Now, in truth, this is a notion that first appeared in the European debate back in 2013, but it really became a sort of prominent notion in the European foreign policy discussions with the 2016 European Global Strategy. Now, in all honesty, back then, it was not a particularly controversial concept. In fact, back then, even the United Kingdom, that was on the verge of leaving the European, or in fact, voting on whether to leave the European Union, actually agreed to refer to this concept. And back then, it was also a notion that was really specifically confined to the area of security and defense. Over those first months, it was a notion that, in a sense, particularly after the election of Donald Trump to the US presidency, sort of became an imperative. I mean, it was obvious that the European Union, precisely because of what was happening in the United States, had to pursue an agenda of strategic autonomy. And then as the months, and in fact, as the years went by, it was a notion that became sort of extended to. It started expanding to other policy areas because of the way in which other global actors started behaving. So all of a sudden, it was not only, or perhaps even not primarily, about security and defense, but it really became about cyber and disinformation, given the actions that Russia increasingly pursued vis-a-vis European countries and the European Union as a whole. It became a story really about energy, again, because of the notion of energy security. It became a concept applied to the area of industry and investments because of the idea of the strategic investments being pursued by China. And of course, it looped back to the United States in the domain of international finance, and in particular the international role of the euro, given the use made, or the threat made, of secondary sanctions by the Trump administration. So this idea of European strategic autonomy really became a way for the European Union to say, well, how do we go about protecting our internal norms and rules, as well as promoting those norms and rules externally at a time in which what is in shorthand referred to as the international liberal order that we so loved living in was beginning to slip away from our hands. So this was basically what it is to begin with. And it's quite interesting to see how really over the last few months, this has become a notion that has become deeply controversial amongst Europeans, and in particular vis-a-vis the relationship with the United States. And obviously this is because of the election of Joe Biden in the United States, and therefore the fact that Europeans once again have a friend and a partner and an ally on which they can count on the other side of the Atlantic. And all of a sudden, strategic autonomy became, on the one hand, it continued to be promoted by some, and on the other, it was opposed by those who felt that pursuing the agenda of strategic autonomy would be detrimental to the relationship with the United States. Now, I personally believe that this is really a straw man counter-argument against European strategic autonomy for a number of reasons. I think particularly if we're looking at this through the lens of security and defense, it is very clear, at least in my mind, that there will continue to be an asymmetric relationship across the Atlantic in security and defense terms. It is very clear in my mind that NATO will continue to be the cornerstone of European territorial defense. And it's perhaps even clearer in my mind that it's actually only by pursuing greater European responsibility and risk-taking in areas like security and defense that rather than this harming the transatlantic relationship, it is actually the precondition for a stronger transatlantic relationship in the 21st century. At the same time, what this report does is highlights the fact that there are actually some good counter-arguments and risks embedded in the notion of strategic autonomy, which have less to do, in my mind, with security and defense, strictly speaking, and more to do with what happens when we extend strategic autonomy to other areas, and in particular to economic areas, whether this is interpreted in digital terms, in energy terms, or more broadly in industrial terms. And I think these risks really revolve around, on the one hand, the risk of a concentration of power in the hands of a few internally within the Union, which often translates in a few member states, and therefore creating imbalances within the Union. And the flip side of this risk is, of course, the external risk of Europeans falling into the trap of protectionism. Now, in my mind, these two risks do not amount to making a case against pursuing an agenda for strategic autonomy, which in my mind is, in a sense, the agenda that should be guiding the European Union in the years and the decades ahead. But it really does point to the fact that we should be cognizant that pursuing autonomy is something to be done with eyes wide open with the risks that this entails. And I think that whereas there isn't a silver bullet solution to all this, on the one hand, strengthening our internal resilience in political, in economic, in fact, across all policy spheres within the Union, investing in our surrounding regions, obviously beginning with countries in the enlargement process, as well as the neighborhood policy, and partnering and strengthening multilateralism, obviously beginning with the relationship with the United States, should be three main guiding lights. So I'll stop there, given that the report is obviously available for all to read, and I hope that even more of you will do so after the end of this meeting. And let me perhaps kick off by giving the floor to Alex Stubb, former all things of Finland, Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Foreign Minister, probably a lot more, for his first remarks, and then on to Steve Erlanger from the New York Times that will be moderating our debate. Alex.
Buongiorno a tutti, mi chiamo Alex, scusa non può essere lì. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm really sorry that I can't be there. I'm coming to you from my flat here in Florence. The room where I'm sitting was built apparently in 1450. And as a Finn, I can only marvel at the level of history and culture, because in 1450 we were still living in grottos. May that be as it is. Warm congratulations to Natalie for writing this paper, European Strategic Autonomy, what it is, why we need it, and how to achieve it. Now, in my allotted 5 minutes, I'll just say a couple of words about it. In the beginning, I want to make it clear that I think this is one of the most important contributions linked to one of the key terms that we're grappling with especially in Europe at the moment. It reminds me in many ways of a debate that was quite rampant in the 1990s, namely around differentiated integration, the possibility for member states to do different things at different times, such as the EMU or Schengen, for instance. And at the time, there was really this sort of indigestion of terminology from a la carte to variable geometry to multi-speed. And there was this young researcher who ended up doing a PhD with the same supervisor that Natalie had, in other words, William Wallace, who wrote a PhD about this differentiated integration. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of PhDs written about strategic autonomy as well. And all of those PhDs will be citing this, what I would call excellent paper. There have been some similar things written. The European Council for Foreign Relations worked with the European External Action Service and did some really good work in trying to make us understand the terminology and the concept. The thing I like about this paper is that in many ways it takes it a step further, because it first explains what strategic autonomy is and what it's not. Then it goes ahead and talks about why we need it and even sort of where we need it and where we don't, and then finally how to achieve it. So in that sense, I see this paper very much at a crossroads between think tank academic analysis, conceptualization, but more as a policy paper which will be useful, I think, for a lot of practitioners. Now, let me run through a few of the key points that I got out of the paper, and then finally what I'll do is basically pose three very practical questions to the panelists, which are partially answered in the paper, but nevertheless need to be dealt with. Now, the first point I wanted to make is about the definition itself. I've been myself grappling about, is it strategic autonomy? Is it strategic sovereignty? What does this mean? Well, this paper now really, really makes it clear, not only because it goes back to ancient Greek and makes the analysis, but it sort of clarifies what things are. And I think it's extremely important to get this definition out and send out a few tweets on it, Natalie. This is what strategic autonomy is, and this is what it is not. And in many ways, in my mind, it sort of gives oxygen, it gives space to a better understanding of what it all is. And one of the things I really liked about it was that the paper did an analysis about what strategic autonomy means internally, in terms of the internal market, in terms of legislation, in terms of basically capacity to act or to regulate. And one, I guess, could argue that given that the European Union is a regulatory superpower, strategic autonomy is part of its DNA to a certain extent. And then also externally, it gave a clear indication of what it's not. And I think in a really nice way, shut down some of the, more political, rhetorical argumentation around the whole concept of strategic autonomy. And I think the paper is very right that this is a contested concept, just like differentiated integration was. And when it's a contested concept, there are two things that quite often happen. One is people don't define or don't understand what it's all about. That's why they react to it. And secondly, if they try to understand what it's all about, they look at their own position. So for instance, on differentiation, if you felt that your country will be outside the core that will be created, you rejected the concept. On strategic autonomy, you might be looking from the economic perspective and thinking, well, if my companies will somehow be linked to the notion of protectionism, I'm not going to like the concept. Or For instance, if you, and I'm simplifying the argument here, like NATO, and you think that strategic autonomy is against NATO or the United States, then you're going to reject it. Now, what this does is, I think in a very neutral kind of way, no pun intended, tries to define and explain what it is and what it's not. I especially like the chronology also in the paper. I wasn't present at the Foreign Affairs Council together with foreign ministers and defense ministers in 2013. I think I was trade minister at the time. But that is clearly the first time when the notion of strategic autonomy has been brought forward in the EU context or in the EU documentation. Now, subsequently, it has become very politicized. There's no question about that. When President Macron speaks about stratégie autonome or strategic autonomy, people say, whoa, what is he saying? This is a French president. Is it anti-NATO? Is he trying to be French protectionist? So they're very sort of strong concepts. And I think Jean-Claude Juncker, as Natalie clearly points out in the paper, was a bit more careful in his State of the Union address in 2018. And then perhaps one more element of being quite prudent about the concept comes with Josep Borrell. And right now you can see that the political debate is very much about, open-ended strategic autonomy. So it's a toying of, with the concepts, and in that sense, I think quite complicated. I also like the way in which the paper actually, links the term of strategic autonomy to, first multilateralism, then multipolarity, and then the link to the United States. Now, finally and thirdly, before I pose my questions, is the sort of, why we need it and how we need it. I think this is a very welcome addition to the debate around the term, because you sort of clearly show where this might work and where it might not, and shoot down some of the myths around it. Now, I do think that at the end of the day, this is such a contested, sometimes even toxic concept inside the European Union, that there will be a need for this type of a discussion, debate, these types of papers more sort of broadly. And of course, my hope is, as a former politician and as a current academic, that someone like Natalie could go into the Foreign Affairs Council, explain that, hey, listen, this is how I see strategic autonomy, and this is what it is, and this is what it is not. So I would like to finish off with three questions that I think the panel might want to tackle in one way or another. They're very broad, but they're also, of course, in the paper in one way or another. So the first question is, how do you overcome political division inside the European Union about the terminology? And here I think it's very much a question of, a minister doesn't always go into the depth of the linguistic analysis of what the concept means. He or she has a rather superficial understanding. So how do you overcome that? So this doesn't become, Macron versus the rest of the European Union. Secondly, how do you overcome the economic division? Because, one could argue, and you do well in the paper as well, that, this has the potential to spill over into protectionist tendencies, both internal and external. So how do you avoid the knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, for me, strategic autonomy means that I can protect my national industry? Now, I think the argument is quite clear when we talk about information technology, when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about the cyberspace in general, when we talk about patents. There needs to be a certain understanding that geopolitics is broader than soldiers and guns and tanks. It's also about the economy, and in the economy it's about data. So therefore, how do we protect our data in a way in which it's not protectionist? And then thirdly, you need to ask the question that how or what is the security division on strategic autonomy? So how do you get away from the dilemma of saying that, you know, strategic autonomy is anti-NATO? So how do you kind of bring Eastern and Central Europe along, or those countries that have a strong attachment, obviously, to the NATO security umbrella? So these three questions: how do you overcome the political division? How do you overcome the economic division? And how do you overcome the security division? Would be a wonderful continuation of what I think is one of the best papers on the subject. Thanks a lot for having me, and hope all of you have a good discussion. Ciao a tutti.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Steve Erlanger from the New York Times in Brussels. I will be your animator today. Thanks to Natalie for the paper. Thanks to Alex, who did 11 minutes when he was asked to do 5, but did it very well. And now I would love all of us to be terser and more to the point so we can get in questions. When we do come to questions, they've asked us to put them, for you to put them into the chat function, but already people have started with the Q&A function, and frankly, that's okay too. Just a brief introduction of this wonderful panel Natalie's put together, pretty much in the order in which I will call on them, which works as a kind of warning or avertissement to my panel. First, Wolfgang Ischinger in Berlin, who's the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, but a renowned diplomat, former German ambassador to the United States and many other places. Then Sylvie Kaufmann in Paris, who is the editorial director of Le Monde, had been a wonderful Washington correspondent and Moscow correspondent and editorialist, writes for us sometimes too, and is an old friend. Then Nick Burns, who is in Massachusetts, superb American diplomat for many, many years, and has been ambassador in Greece and at NATO, and has been at the NSC, and has been political director, done many, many things. Then Madame Fu Ying. Madame Fu is a well-known Chinese former ambassador, I believe, to Australia and to the United Kingdom, if I'm not wrong. She's chairperson of the National People's Congress Foreign Affairs Committee, and is with us from Beijing. And then posledny, but not last, Andrei Kortunov in Moscow, who's Director General of the Russian International Affairs Councils. Strasti Andrei. So we have this extraordinary report by Natalie, which is very, very useful because it tries to talk about this word, this phrase, strategic autonomy, which has come to mean both nothing and everything in a way that's both historical and substantive. We kind of agree it's the ability to act on one's own when required, and of course when Europe agrees. But to me, it's become to mean everything from face masks to data. But to me, there's not a big debate over Europe needing to do more on those things. It still is, to a large degree, over defense and over NATO, and to some degree over secondary sanctions and how Europe defends itself. A little bit, I have the feeling that strategic autonomy, it's a bit like St. Augustine. I'd like it, but maybe not yet, because I'd like to be good, but not yet, because it's expensive and it's difficult. But it is an important debate. So the first thing I will ask everyone to respond to what they've read in a couple of minutes, but I want to ask Wolfgang in particular. The report buys this assumption that the United States is fading, it's distracted, it's less interested in European defense and affairs, partly because of China's rise. Can Europe no longer rely on the United States? What do you think, Wolfgang?
First of all, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Natalie. I can only join in the praise which Alex just expressed and which others have also expressed. So I think this is a really important contribution to the debate that the European Union needs about its own future capabilities, about its own long-term vision, etc. So congratulations, first and foremost. I would want to start by offering a caveat. We have occasionally, in the conduct of the EU internal debate, we have occasionally suffered from a chronic disease, which I would call an overabundance of rhetoric. In the case of Germany, for example, you find in almost each and every party program, left and right, the idea, and not only in the last 2, 3, 5 years, but going back to the 1990s or early 2000s, you find the idea of a European army. And everybody embraced the idea of a European army without ever spelling out what exactly would need to happen in order to create it, who would command it, and what might be the consequences of it. So I hope that the term of strategic autonomy as a very, very important definition of our vision going forward will not exhaust itself by this terminology debate, but that we will be asking, and I'm asking right now the question, so what exactly needs to happen for the European Union to move in that direction? I'm humble enough not to say to become autonomous by tomorrow morning, but to move in the direction of being more autonomous going forward. So that's my first caveat. Second, and that is an attempt to respond to your question, Steve. We cannot assume, as Chancellor Merkel remarked after her first return from her first visit with President Trump in May of 2017, apparently we can no longer indefinitely rely on the fact that somebody else will take care of our security needs, speaking of the United States, but that obviously we're going to have to take this more into our own hands. That was essentially what she said in a beer hall outside of Munich, a place called Trudering, in May, so that this was practically almost 4 years ago. What does this mean? Quite frankly, I think, and I will focus on the transatlantic aspects, not so much on the internal aspects. Quite frankly, we need to make sure that we're not going to be misunderstood with this concept on the other side of the Atlantic. And I want to offer just 2 simple thoughts. Because of things that happened on the other side of the Atlantic, we are today finding ourselves in a situation where the EU needs to defend our own interests, also vis-a-vis the United States, whether we like it or not. This is true when we talk about these famous so-called secondary sanctions. It is not okay, in my view, to simply, ignore the fact that there have been efforts, and some of these efforts going back to the Trump era, of course, have their after effects. In the case of Germany, I'm talking about Nord Stream 2 and the secondary sanctions, which the Congress, which the Senate, a Senate majority, a bipartisan majority, apparently continues to wish to see implemented by the Biden administration. I think it is a task for the European Union to think about how we can immunize ourselves against these types of non-military, non-directly security-related challenges to our way of doing things. Just raise it as a question mark. Last point on the famous NATO and direct security-related issues. I think it's very important that we translate the ambition to become autonomous by not only talking, but doing something about capabilities, referring to 2% or such clearly defined goals, as well as our internal EU internal decision-making methods. Our decision-making methods in foreign policy, security, and defense are deplorable and miserable, and they will not encourage anyone outside the European Union to believe that we are a serious actor if we have on each and every single issue of third-grade importance the veto right offered to each and every single member. It's not the way to go forward. Very last point, Steve. In 2006, when Chancellor Merkel spoke at the Munich Security Conference for the first time, having just been elected Chancellor, she made a point which I think is extremely relevant to this discussion, because she raised the question, are we using NATO as the priority place, as the priority platform, forum, or whatever you want to call it, to discuss our security challenges? And her idea at the time, and I repeat it here, was let's try to agree that we will always go to NATO first and try to find out whether this is something that NATO should address. And if NATO declines this particular question, then it may be for the EU or it may not be for the EU to take up. I think if we accompanied the vision of strategic autonomy with a recommitment to the priority of the NATO forum for our key security challenges, then we will not risk being misunderstood on the other side of the Atlantic as we indulge in the strategic autonomy effort. Thank you very much.
Great, Wolfgang. Thank you very, very much. Very thoughtful and honest. Deplorable, that's my favorite word these days. So I'm going to turn to Sylvie. I'm not going to ask you to defend any particular position, but to help us understand President Macron's, he has pushed the idea of strategic autonomy probably more than any recent politician. He always says in the context of NATO, but there are a lot of people, including people in Germany, who aren't really sure what he actually means and worry, which this report also explains, that strategic autonomy may be just another way of saying, let's get our neighbors to help in the French interest and to buy French arms and goods. So, Sylvie, you've read the report. What do you think?
Hello, good morning, good evening. I think it's an excellent report, of course. It's extremely useful. I hope Emmanuel Macron reads it because it will probably help him to reorganize or re-rationalize his thoughts about this issue. Thank you, Natalie, for tracing back the origins of this concept, because I've read in one of the many, many long interviews that Emmanuel Macron has given over the past 3.5 years, that he inaugurated the notion in his speech at the Sorbonne. And what is right is that, as you said, he's put it at the center of the European conversation. And I think that's even in a controversial way, but I think that has been extremely useful because at least we are now debating it in all its forms and even in all its misunderstandings. And I think even this controversy suited Macron. As we say, there's no bad thing as there's no such thing as a bad publicity. Sorry. So what does it mean? That's I think the French are getting tired of the rhetoric also, and I hear here and there more often, enough of the semantic debate, enough of the rhetoric. Let's go into action. Let's talk about how do we do concrete things. And I think this debate has been more and more prevalent since Joe Biden has been elected, of course, because during the transition, all of us here have taken part in many Zoom meetings and conversations, transatlantic conversations. And I've heard several times our American friends, and I think Nick Burns will see what I mean, saying, look, you Europeans want more autonomy, great. We are ready for you to share more of the burden. We are going to be extremely busy on this side of the Atlantic, meaning the American side, and we would really like you to do more for your neighborhood, for your, now, and that makes sense, and I think we can all hear this very easily. Now, when Wolfgang make this wonderful thing of getting Joe Biden and Macron and Merkel at this Munich Security Conference online a few weeks ago, Emmanuel Macron answers Joe Biden by talking about what else? Strategic autonomy. And then our American friends are upset. I've heard some of them saying we were disappointed. Now, why? I think we have this wonderful opportunity now to talk concretely about how we are going to do this together. Now that Donald Trump is not there, and some people said that actually Donald Trump was an excellent factor in pushing forward strategic autonomy, because in an adverse way. I think we have another factor pushing forward strategic autonomy, and it's COVID-19. But this is maybe an issue we'll address later. But I think this is a very important context, because we can see now how little autonomous we are in terms of health, in terms of medical equipment, in terms of vaccine. So just to finish, because you want us to be short, Stephen.
The first round.
I think we both have to do our homework, both meaning on both sides of the Atlantic, we have to do our homework. I think the Americans have to tell the Europeans, what does burden sharing mean? Does it mean only sharing the burden, or does it also mean decision sharing? And does it also mean equipment buying sharing? As the French defense minister said, NATO solidarity means Article 5, not Article 535. This is an issue not only for the French. I think it's an issue for all Europeans who make equipment, and it obviously has a very, very important consequences on the equipment you buy for your armed forces. Of course, has very important consequences on the way you direct your armed forces and so on. And I think for the Europeans, as Natalie puts it very well in her report, the Europeans first have to put their money where their mouth is. That's true, and they have to put their house in order. We have to be more united, and so Alexander Stubb asked, how do we do this? That's an excellent question. But this is really something we have to work very hard on. I'm surprised at how little we have heard from our European friends from Central Europe since Joe Biden has been elected. They're obviously a big part of this debate on strategic autonomy, but we don't hear too much of them over the past, since November. So yes, we have to talk about how to achieve a common strategic culture, about how to achieve a common perception, or at least, to share our perceptions of threats. And otherwise, this goal of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, and I'm not going to engage in the differences, maybe, I think from the French perspective, from a French point of view, we use these two concepts indifferently, and I think, yes, they have more or less the same meaning. But, this goal will stay elusive if we don't do this.
Great, thank you. I mean, one of the things that struck me when Macron was speaking to the Munich Security Conference was almost a defensiveness, saying to Europeans, please don't let this nice Mr. Biden divert us from the things we need to do, because the world is changing and America's role in the world is changing anyway. So
May I just add one very,
yes, please.
One very short
Sure.
point, Stephen, that I forgot to mention about this this reputation or this suspicion that's always on the French to be against NATO. This is something I don't know how you can put it. Of course, there's the discourse and all this, and the posture or the attitude, but there's also the work on the ground. And the French are really working a lot with NATO and with the Americans. And the French armed forces couldn't do what they are doing in Sahel, in Africa, without the Americans. So, there's also the reality and the...
It's true. And I mean, and Macron always stresses that he wants to work within NATO, that his notion of strategic autonomy is not against NATO. That's what he says. Let's believe him. Nick Burns in Boston, the question Sylvie quite rightly raises is American ambivalence to European efforts to do more. What is burden sharing? Why is this ambivalence there? Is it about industry? Is it about PESCO? And what's the answer? And anyway, your turn. Nick Burns.
Steve, thank you. Steve, thank you very much for moderating today. You're a great friend. Natalie, thank you very much for bringing us together. We're looking forward to welcome Natalie to Harvard as a visiting professor, pandemic willing, in September. Steve, I know you value above all else brevity. And so I'm going to I've just got 4 quick points. The first point is this. I think at this stage of this debate about strategic autonomy, we should put aside the war of words, and we should focus on what Europe needs and wants, and what certainly its allies in North America, the US and Canada, also want. We need a more powerful Europe, a stronger Europe on the global stage. We need European leadership in the World Health Organization during the pandemic. On the Paris Climate Change Agreement, by definition, where the EU has been leading, on trade, on human rights, on defense and security. So if you put the emphasis on a more powerful Europe, that means a more powerful European Union and a more powerful set of European allies in NATO. That's what's important. The words aren't that important. Second point, we certainly need a stronger Europe in NATO. I know that, having been ambassador there for 3.5 years. If the goal now, and it is our goal, is to contain Russian power in Eastern Europe, protect Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, struggle against what Putin did in Georgia in 2008, in Crimea in 2014, still in the Donbass to this very day, we need increased defense spending. And we need greater capacity in the digital age as AI and biotech and quantum sciences are militarized. And that's what NATO needs to focus on. That's where Jens Stoltenberg is trying to bring NATO. And Europe has to be at the center of that. And I think Europe can be at the center of that. Since the annexation illegally of Crimea by Russia, there have been real increases in the defense budgets, real increases since 2014 of every NATO member. And we see it certainly, Sylvie, in France, which I think Americans are very grateful for. And we're seeing it in Germany, as Wolfgang can attest, as Germany has gone from 1.1 to 1.5% of its GDP on defense. And the notion that somehow the United States is no longer focused on Europe, we are. I mean, obviously the Indo-Pacific, as you've seen in our diplomacy of Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin over the last couple of weeks, it's a central issue for us to compete with China, to build up our alliances with Japan, Australia, South Korea, our strategic partnership with India, including in the Quad. But here are some data points about Europe. Europe's the largest investor in the American economy. Europe's the largest trade partner of the United States. And Europe, of course, includes the largest number of American treaty allies in the world, along with Canada. So point 2, we need a stronger Europe and NATO. Point 3, the larger issue beyond our transatlantic debate over words, strategic autonomy, strategic leadership, power, is that all of us are democracies in NATO. And we need to have the self-confidence and the capacity, as President Biden has been talking about, to compete with the authoritarian powers, Russia and China. This is not just a Joe Biden initiative. This was very much an initiative of the Trump administration. And I think if you look at the major politicians, Republican and Democrats in Congress, there is agreement that we need to be more strongly attached to NATO and to our European allies, as well as our Indo-Pacific allies, because competing with China and Russia is the overarching global priority, to compete against their cyber aggression, against you and against us. Largest cyber attack in history, Russia's, over the last 2 to 3 months. The belief, common belief here, that China was behind the attack on Microsoft. We need to defend against their cyber aggression. We need to defend against their violations of human rights in places like Hong Kong and Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs, the arrest of Alexei and imprisonment unjustly of Alexei Navalny, Russian support for the dictator in Minsk, in Belarus. This completely separates us from the Russians and Chinese, and it ought to unify the French, the Germans, the Latvians, the Finns, the Americans, the Canadians, about human freedom. And last point, Steve, strategic autonomy. The words don't translate well, at least not into American English. I'm not sure it even translates into British English. In this sense, Europe's the last place in the world that wants to be alone. I think most Europeans, as I understand you, but Sylvie and Wolfgang will correct me if I'm wrong, they're free to do that. Europe wants to be part of a larger world, integrated with the democratic world, and we need Europe to lead as a powerful country. So I would suggest put aside the war of words and focus on the facts, and focus on building, working with your natural partners, Canada and the United States, and our East Asian allies, all democratic. Thanks, Steve.
Nick, thank you very, very much. One of the things I should say, as my internet's getting shaky, I apologize, is that the report does try to define strategic autonomy by saying Europe still wants to be a multilateral power and work within multilateral institutions, but needs the ability to act when it needs to or must. So I must say, in the term, there's a lot of confusion. I mean, is it about sovereignty? Is it about self-image? Is it about resentment of American leadership or worries about it? Even as under the Trump administration, the United States did more to enhance deterrence inside NATO, despite Trump's angry words, than Obama ever did. So it's an interesting question. I'm now going to turn to Madame Fu in Beijing, if she's still with us. I'm sure she is. Madame Fu, do you regard this idea of Europe doing more for itself, of strategic autonomy, is that a welcome event in the world from your point of view?
First, thank you for inviting me to join you. And also, I'm very pleased to see so many friends, although virtually. Listen to your discussions. I've read the report and listened to your discussions. I find I'm not part of your debate, but China and like Russia, we are partly of your targets. So let me share with you 3 brief points. First, strategic autonomy. I've heard you discussing it on a number of occasions. My feeling is that it's a policy choice of EU in response to the international structural changes. And EU needs the space for independent thinking and policy making. And in principle, I think it is understandable and should be respected. Generally speaking, by the way, the tension between China and US has bewildered many countries. Most parties want to avoid taking sides. And China is not asking EU or any party to take sides with China because such a move, we believe, would lead to bloc politics. And it can lead to the splitting up of the world and more likely to slide down to the path of Cold War. But on the other hand, I also hope Europe would respect China and its independent views. Second point, China-Europe have fostered comprehensive cooperative relations. The relationship is valuable in itself, in its own sense, and does not rely on others, nor should it be used to influence other parties. China all along have supported Europe's integrity, unity, and its role in international affairs. And Europe has helped China in its reform and opening up through wide collaboration. And China now has grown into the biggest trading partner of EU, and our relationship, we believe, is mutually beneficial. For example, during the COVID-19 outbreak, for example, China-Europe Railway Express has transported large quantity of much needed medical supplies when the international communication suffered cutoff. According to the latest survey of EU Chamber of Commerce in China, more than 60% of the enterprises here are willing to increase their investments, which indicates the bright prospect of the relationship. Third point, the report on European strategic autonomy has outlined the need for Europe to understand China better, which I welcome, and to further develop relations. It also expressed concerns over the differences, which is hurting the relationship. Admittedly, there are disagreements between China and Europe, which needs to be clarified to each other. Nick mentioned human rights, and the report also mentioned human rights. But for many people here in China, there's a feeling that human rights is a term, is a hammer to hit China. Ever since I was an interpreter, we have always been in a debate. For 40 years, there's non-stop, but the content kept on changing. 40 years ago, I remember the debate was on whether the prison conditions in China was good enough, whether the Chinese people had the freedom of movement. And during 2008, you remember during the Olympics, it was Tibet. Now it's Xinjiang, now it's Hong Kong. There's no end. So there is a fatigue here in China. But I do believe there is a need for China to maybe to provide more information to the world to clarify the disinformation. So we don't have time to elaborate on the specific points, but I would like to call on the two sides to open up to more channels of dialogue and to enable systemic communications on our differences. And for EU and US, we don't have problem about your relationship, and we follow with interest your debate. But if you need to unite each other, you should not need to make China your enemy. It's not necessary. I think given the fast changing world landscape, we do need more solid social foundation for the progress of the China-EU relationship. And I do hope there is a better communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Fu. If I could just ask you one quick question, which comes up all the time. Is it better for China, do you think, to be dealing with the Brussels structures of the EU or with the individual European states? Which works out better for Beijing?
Very good question. When I was in charge of European relationship with China as a vice minister of foreign affairs, Brussels dialogue is a headache for China because it's very difficult to make a progress. There was always negativity. It was very difficult for me to find people who would like to visit Brussels. They would like to make progress with individual countries. It works better, but I think there need to be more effort on both sides, Chinese side and Brussels, to make progress, to find agreement instead of engage in debate in finger pointing all the time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. As a Brussels correspondent, I have some sympathy for this point of view. Andrei Kortunov in Moscow. When we talk about NATO and European strategic autonomy, Nick was explicit about Crimea and Putin. But from Russia's point of view, or just your point of view as an analyst, do you have high hopes for strategic autonomy, or is this just really the beginning of a very long road that may go nowhere? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Steve, for the question. And I'm glad that I have a chance to be a part of this very interesting discussion. Let me say that as far as I can see the Russian position towards the European strategic autonomy, it is controversial, and I would even venture to say that to some degree schizophrenic. Because on the one hand, definitely if the Kremlin is serious about its vision of the common multipolar, polycentric world, if Moscow is interested in devolution of global power, which it claims it is, it should definitely support and endorse and cheer any movement of the European Union towards a more strategic autonomy. And only a more independent or a more autonomous European Union can stand up to US extraterritorial sanctions, can make its voice heard on issues like Syria or Libya or JCPOA, and only a stronger European Union can become a partner of the Russian Federation. However, we see that it is not always the case. And sometimes the Russian leadership expresses very clear and biased criticism of the EU effort to get to greater strategic autonomy. I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, and here I'd like to echo what Madame Fu has just said, for Moscow, it has always been easier to deal with the individual EU member states rather than with the European Union at large. In fact, the Kremlin has never properly mastered its ability to work with Brussels. And I think that definitely there is a lot of skepticism about the Brussels red tape. Second, I think it's important that the overall perception in Moscow, to the extent I can judge about this perception, is that in the end of the day, the strategic autonomy will not work. That whatever the European Union is trying to do will be consumed by the NATO alliance if we are talking about the security dimension, and the United States will continue to play the upper hand. Of course, it is still a hypothesis that has to be checked. We don't know what will happen to Nord Stream 2. We don't know what will happen to new US sanctions and how these will be met in Brussels. Nevertheless, I think that there is a degree of skepticism about the future of the strategic autonomy in Europe. Let me also say that, of course, Moscow laments quite a lot about Europe not being able to talk in a single voice on issues that are of importance to Russia. For instance, you take Libya, and politicians in Moscow argue that it's very difficult to interact with the European Union since it doesn't have an integrated position on Libya. But I think that there is a degree of hypocrisy in this position because, in fact, this is exactly what allows Russia to punch above its weight. Not only Russia, by the way, but also Turkey, for example. Putin and Erdogan can set the rules of engagement in Libya and in Syria without paying too much attention to the European position. I think that in the end of the day, Russia is definitely going to be a deal taker, not a deal maker on these issues. And I can only hope that Russia will ultimately appreciate the importance of a stronger European Union, a European Union that might be a more difficult partner to work with, but also a more reliable and a more productive partner for the Russian Federation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. And I'm glad you brought up this sensitive issue, which interests me quite a lot, of secondary sanctions, the way Washington uses the power of the dollar and the American banking system to hit a target, whether it's Iran or Russia, but ends up hurting European companies. And even when, let's say, Borrell may agree that the target is okay, there's enormous resentment here about secondary sanctions and how to protect themselves. But as so often, it's a question of how much of a unity will the European Union be? Is it heading toward more union or not? That's one of the great fundamental questions to me, because to do that, you'd need a euro that really is a global currency, a reserve currency, which it isn't, doesn't look to be. And it's like when you look at the European Union and vaccines, I mean, as it tries to be a state, it doesn't always do very well. So these are the questions that kind of come back to me when I think of European defense also. But again, that's personal. I'm a foreigner. But these are at the heart of Natalie's wonderful report. So I've been asked, we have with us Fabio Castaldo, who's the Vice President of the European Parliament in Brussels. And Fabio, if you're there, would you like to add something to this conversation, please?
Thank you very much, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really a big pleasure for me to have the chance to exchange views with all the distinguished panelists that took the floor before me. We want all to discuss a concept that is, as was said, that was crucial in the last months, in the last years, the concept of European strategic autonomy. First of all, let me congratulate really with Director Tocci, with my dear friend Natalie, and all the EI staff that contributed to work on this paper. It's extremely enlightening, and personally, I share largely the contents that have been included therein. Although providing a clear definition of the concept of strategic autonomy, as it was said, should be the first and the foremost responsibility for the EU institutions, mostly the Commission and the Council, I believe that pieces of research of this kind will be a paramount for supporting exactly the shape of this definition. And indeed, it is of the utmost importance to clearly define what we mean by strategic autonomy and what we mean not. The latter is even more important in some cases, since it can prevent misunderstanding both domestically and internationally. That is, as was underlined so far, one of the biggest risks. Therefore, when I started to read this paper, I was extremely pleased to see already in the first page the differences between autonomy, independence, unilateralism, and even autarky were addressed. We should all be very clear, as you were in this paper. Pursuing strategic autonomy, the EU will not become something else from what it has always been. We will continue to represent the champion of multilateralism, and we prefer, of course, of action that will always be based on meaningful partnership and cooperation in every domain, from security and defense to industrial development and the fight against the most pressing challenge of our times. That means, of course, the COVID pandemic in the immediate term, and the climate change and the environmental deterioration in the medium one. Therefore, as it was described, objection to the pursuit of strategic autonomy based on the fact that this is an illusion and it can entail some level of isolationism, of deterioration of the transatlantic boundaries, and the EU involvement in all multilateral fora, therefore being counterproductive, are simply wrong in my personal perspective, quite the contrary. But speaking and focusing on the security domain, a field with which I confront on a daily basis, being the only Italian full member in the subcommittee of security and defense, I'm convinced that a more autonomous Europe capable of taking over the bigger share of responsibility, especially in its neighborhood, will extremely benefit the whole NATO, increasing its global role without focusing all its efforts in Europe and its proximities. However, to take this role and to become the main security provider, and here coming to my question, we need to define our strategic goals better. That was something that was also underlined previously by Sylvie Kaufmann when she was speaking about the need to share perception of the threats, the common strategic culture to build up, and also by Wolfgang Ischinger when he was speaking about a clear calendar of capabilities goal to build up. And this is my question. I would like to discuss with you the role of the strategic compass currently under development. I'm firmly convinced that this new instrument, representing a unicum in the EU foreign policy history, will give us an occasion that we must use properly and meaningfully. Being based on threats and priorities analysis conducted by the individual member states, which will be then elaborated and divided into clusters by the EU institutions, the strategic compass can give us this detailed overview of what the EU's family components thinks and are worried about, finally with a bottom-up approach and not with a top-down one. This might seem maybe the apex of the intergovernmental approach that has the limits that were underlined previously also by Nick, by the others who take the floor, that always was reducing the EU efficiency and rapidity to act, for instance, through the unanimity that is required in the Council. But however, if the elaboration of the result provided by the member states will be summed up to take stock of all the prerogatives and not simply synthesized on the basis of vague connections with those expressed only by certain countries, I think that we can really create the condition for establishment of a more supranational approach and a shared and common culture on security.
Super.
Then, of course, let's say, conducting this exercise, we can create all the meaningful clusters responding to certain threats and addressing also some political prerogatives in which each member state can find its place, thus facilitating their willingness to give up some levels of national sovereignty in specific issues and reducing also the present fragmentation. It would be easier for them to cooperate both in the capability development process and in the longer term at the operational level, potentially also giving a real and clear raison d'etre to the EU battle groups. So, as it was mentioned in the paper, EU strategic autonomy starts at home. And do you believe how do you think? What do you think about the strategic compass? That if it will be used in that way I illustrated, or in another one that you have in mind, can pave the way for a clear and substantial, deeper commitment by the EU member states to this cause? Thank you again. And I'm looking forward to hear the consideration. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, one of the things I'm intrigued by, because of course NATO is doing a similar exercise, and I'd be really shocked if the EU strategic compass and the NATO exercise were actually very different, but it would be interesting to see how they mesh. So I want to come back to Sylvie first, if I may, just with a quick question, which I want to understand better. Part of what President Macron wants to do is to use NATO to talk more about political matters, like what to do about Syria, what to do about Libya. He's been pretty open about that. That's not a traditional French position. The French position has been keep politics out of NATO. And of course, NATO is not all of the EU. I think there are only 19 or 20 EU members inside NATO. So I'm curious what you think of this, and then what Nick thinks of it also. I mean, can NATO be used for this kind of political discussion? And Nick, as a former NATO ambassador, ought to have a pretty good notion. So Sylvie, what do you think?
I think the French, I mean, Macron is interested in, he's obviously very much interested in security, as you know, and he's ready to take whatever is available. And he knows that for how much he wishes for European sovereignty or strategic autonomy, it is not there. And it's still, as we've all understood, and as we can see in Natalie's report, it's still a long way to go. So, and he is also, I think, sincere in when he says that it has, Europe has to work with NATO, and, even if Europe succeeds in progressing towards more defense autonomy, it will still have to work with NATO. And I don't think there's any doubt about this. And, this controversy about brain death and so on was not, it was not against NATO. In a way, you could even put the case that he just wanted NATO to work better and to
pay attention.
And to pay attention, yeah. So, so to answer your question on Syria and Libya, of course, the French have been involved in both. I mean, in their own way, officially and unofficially. But both are extremely frustrating experiences. And so I think what Macron wants basically is to manage to have, to be more successful.
Great. Nick, do you have a thought on this?
Well, thanks to Sylvie for her very good comment. I would just say this, Steve, I think realistically speaking, we need to do more in NATO. NATO cannot just be about security and defense. It has to be about our joint responsibilities beyond Europe. And so right now, of course, NATO is the right place to discuss Afghanistan, given the fact that we're all together in Afghanistan. It's the right place to discuss both Iraq and Syria, and even Mali, Sylvie, where your country's done so well to take the lead, and really we're in support of you. So NATO needs to be used much more broadly. But to be realistic, there'll be many other issues where we want to talk directly to Ursula von der Leyen and the EU. If it's trade, if it's health, those kinds of issues. And of course, because so many of the European countries prize their ability to act as nation states, there's nothing that can replace a very engaged strategic relationship between the United States and France, the United States and Germany, the United States and Poland, the United States and Sweden or Finland. And so I think you're going to see those three areas used, but there is a recognition that our security is so much on the line right now. When it comes to Russia and China, certainly the best place to have that strategic discussion to contain their power and to compete with them will be at NATO.
Great, thanks. And Wolfgang, I also wanted to ask you something. Sometimes people say that in terms of strategic autonomy, the Germans don't really want it to be much about defense, but they do want it to be about trade and the economy. In other words, they want freedom of action to do what they want in terms of the export model, while being protected by the American umbrella, which they don't want to be undermined. Is this unfair, do you think? Or is this a fair assumption about what Germany's real understanding of strategic autonomy is?
I think this is fair enough. Obviously, we have a greater urge than most of our French friends to think about NATO in terms of preventing a situation where we could be where extortion, nuclear extortion, could work against a non-nuclear country like Germany and its other non-nuclear partners. So for us, NATO is probably even more existentially relevant than it may be from the view of some of our French friends with their own independent capabilities. But obviously, yes, I think it is fair enough, and it's a reflection of Natalie's really superb paper that strategic autonomy should not cover only the military, the defense and security question, but also our ability to, our collective ability, not simply the German ability to defend our interests in the economic sphere. And I think I did refer in my opening remarks to the question of sanctions. I think we should be very, very strict in letting our American friends know that if President Biden wishes to be trusted when he recommits to working with allies and partners, applying sanctions against partners whose policies, for whatever reason, are not liked by everybody in the US Congress is actually not a good method. And I understand perfectly well that this is not, not the fault of Joe Biden or of his administration, but this is an inheritance from the last administration. In other words, we have a problem which we need to hopefully discuss. And I've been, some of you will be aware of this, I've been actively engaged in trying to move my own government toward making an opening move and starting a discussion with the Biden administration in order to get rid of this problem. But in the future, strategically speaking, I think it is in the interest of the European Union to be less exposed than has been the case in the past to these kind of pressures, whether they come from China or whether they come from the United States or from others.
This is right, because one of the big concerns I know the German BDI, the Federation of Industry, has is that not just the United States will start to use secondary sanctions, but other countries will too, including China. And then for Europe to be caught having to choose between its two big trading partners would be a nightmare that nobody really wants. We have some really good questions, and I haven't left tons of time to address them, but let me bring up one from Poland, I believe, from Piotr Buros, because we haven't really talked much about this part of the EU, and it's crucial. And he says one way to convince skeptics like Poland about the need for European strategic autonomy would be to inject a security policy dimension into the Eastern Partnership, if not high-end, then at least cyber cooperation, training, etc. But his view is that the big countries, France and Germany, seem to be against it. So, I mean, the larger question is there an imbalance in this narrative about strategic autonomy and sort of basically what's in it for the slightly newer members of Central and Eastern Europe? Anyone who wants to try to answer that would be great. I throw it open. Wolfgang, please.
Well, just one brief remark. One of the reasons why, for example, the German defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, came out rather emphatically in not endorsing President Macron's idea, is the concern that our term might be exploited by the unfortunately growing number of anti-American, activists in our country. We are not interested in offering fuel to those who believe that equidistance is the way to go, and etc. So there is this underlying concern: how can we make sure that we will not feed the bad guys in terms of maintaining a close transatlantic relationship? There's just a footnote to this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Another question we have from Leah Schwagereit, I'm mispronouncing and I apologize, but it's about something that we haven't really talked about. Part of strategic autonomy has been the European efforts to have a European Defense Fund and this oddly named PESCO, which sounds like some kind of pharmaceutical, but it's an effort to make European defense spending more project-oriented and more efficient. And yet there's been a lot of criticism that it cuts out third countries who are allies, important allies of the European Union, now including, of course, Britain, as well as the US, Canada, Norway. So this is, again, it came up in the report, the risk of strategic autonomy seeming protectionist. And I wondered whether anyone wanted to try to respond to that. Maybe not. Nick, I mean, do you think this is a big American concern?
I think it's one of the American concerns. I just say, Steve, two things. First, on the question, the last question, we already have NATO engaged in Central Europe. We have NATO troops, battalion level, in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So there really isn't a need for an EU initiative there if you subscribe to the principle that NATO ought to be taking the lead on security issues, and the EU should not try to duplicate. On the question of PESCO, look, I think Americans should not be ideological either. And if this is a way to motivate European parliaments to promote greater defense spending and greater military capacity in what they spend money on, then Americans should favor a more powerful EU as well as NATO, as long as the EU is not duplicative again, but complementary and integrated. I know that sounds theological, but I think if Americans have been arguing for 40 to 50 years, as we have, going all the way back to Jimmy Carter and even before him, that Europeans should spend more, whatever way they get there should be up to Europe. And we should assume that they're going to prioritize NATO in the defense sphere.
It makes sense. Of course, they have taxpayers too, and their taxpayers would like to see their tax money spent at home and not necessarily on F-35s, maybe. So the point's well taken. The one worry is you now have 2 European jet fighter projects in a market that's shrinking. So maybe one of the things the strategic compass can do is figure out a way to have only one jet fighter. Madam Fu, I wanted to come back to you if I could. You've been very, very patient with us. Brussels has talked about the Chinese investment deal that was done with the EU at the end of last year as an example of strategic autonomy, of Europe pursuing its own interests. And yet it obviously has had some criticism and won't be ratified probably until 2022. Do you have concerns about it? Do you think it's going to go through, and do you see it as an example of Europe standing on its own feet?
Trade and investment is not my familiar territory.
Fair enough.
But I've been following the issue. I think it was an important achievement for the two sides after so many years of negotiations. Finally, can reach an agreement. And the business circle in both countries have very high expectations of the deal moving into reality. I think if there are the reservations or concerns, I think EU should be able to overcome it, since it was finally having made the decision to agree with China. And the terms were quite good. Some of the issues were debated, discussed between China and US, but because of all kinds other kinds of reasons that there were no consensus between China and US, but China and EU could somehow get through the stumbling blocks and arriving at the agreement. I think it's a very important achievement. Both sides values it.
Good, good, thank you. And then Andre, if I could come to you, there's just been, Joseph Borrell had a terrible visit to Moscow, which was much criticized by everyone. He said it was important because the European Union is about to discuss at its summit meeting at the end of this week relations with Russia, and yet everyone now seems to be saying they're at the worst ever. I mean, do you agree with that, or is this part of European defensiveness? How do you see it? I mean, do you see them really terrible, or do you think this will pass in time?
Oh, it will pass in time, of course. The question.
Yes, well, so will we all.
Yeah, but let me say that, of course, it was a disaster, and I followed this trip, and I think the timing was wrong, the perceptions were not correct, and of course, the Russian side did not demonstrate the hospitality that it had to. But the only silver lining that I see in this cloud is that after Borrell went back to Brussels, both sides tried really hard to limit the damage. And if you look at the EU sanctions against Russia, passed after Borrell got back to EU, these were purely symbolic sanctions, very, very measured, only for individuals, no attempt at sectoral sanctions. And even in terms of rhetoric, I think both sides are trying to keep the room for further negotiations open. But indeed, I think the situation is deplorable. I don't think that it will get any better anytime soon. And the situation reflects a profound gap in values between the political leadership in Moscow on the one hand and the leadership of the European Union on the other.
Thank you. We've pretty much run out of time. I'm sorry, I probably mismanaged this, but we have lots of wonderful questions. But I hate interrupting these wonderful interventions people have made. So I urge everyone to read this report, which is really, quite substantive. I mean, it's not one of these 2-page off the top of their head reports. There's a lot of work here. It's an issue that's going to run and run. It's not going to go away. And if Natalie is right, that the world has changed structurally, then Europe finds itself in a real dilemma. And how it manages its interests between the United States and China, between the US and Russia, with China, will define, I think, the next 10 years. So I thank you all. I thank Natalie, of course, and I will turn it over to her, I think, for a few final words. Or Natalie?
Yeah, just Steve, simply to say a big thank you to all of our guests, all of our panelists, a main big thank you to Steve, I think, for really making this discussion so interesting and possible today. And I guess my sort of two main takeaways from today's discussion is, firstly, I realize just how controversial this concept is, not only amongst Europeans, this much I knew, and not only across the Atlantic, but also how controversial it is, sort of looking beyond, sort of listening to the views from China, from Russia. My second main takeaway is that perhaps this is so controversial because there has been so much talk about this and so little action, and perhaps the degree of controversy, at least within Europe and transatlantically, perhaps less so when it comes to Russia and China, would actually reduce if we concentrated more on the action and less on the talk. So simply to say again, thank you. I guess let the debate continue, and above all, let the action begin. Thanks, everyone.